Welcome to the Living Superfood Show. My name is Yamoya, and I'm here with my co host, the one and only Master Chef, Health and Food Scientist, Kidi Owadu. How are you doing today, sir?
Greetings to you, my brother Umoya. How are we doing? We black and we shine. So we're having a great time over here. Life is a beautiful thing. We always try to keep people reminded of that. We also do our best to give the people the information that allows us to take control of our lives, to be self-determining people. And through self-determination, through truth, we have true freedom.
All right, sounds good. So today we're going to be talking about apoptosis, COVID-19 slash AIDS, and the pandemic, aka the toilet paper revolution. All right, so let's go. The first topic, apoptosis. Who coined the term, and can you give us a brief history on the discovery?
Okay, I have been writing about apoptosis, programmed cell death, for quite some time, and so this is the very first time that someone asked me, give me the origins of it. So I had to do just a real quick web search, but I'll just share a couple of sentences of what we come up with, and then put that in context. Apoptosis really arrives to us at the advent of the use of electron microscopy, the most powerful microscopes used today, that are able to see things on a much, much smaller scale than the traditional microscopes people are accustomed to, that can see individual cells. You can see sperm cells on a fairly common purchased microscope, and you can see other type of single cell bacterial life, etc. But when it comes to seeing the cell subcomponents, and inside of every cell is a complex of components, what are called organelles and subcellular structures, that literally could be considered as complex as, say, a luxury automobile, these subsystems in there. So eventually the technology catches up that they can amplify the view of these subcomponents, and then they start identifying. So then this comes right around the same time that the research on DNA, genetic material inside the nucleus of the cell, appears. So this is in the early to late 50s. So apoptosis begins with the studies at Cambridge University. Sidney Brenner's studies on animal development, and he's joining with other scientists such as Robert Hovitz, and together they won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in physiology or medicine. So this really shows you the significance of the subcellular research that they were doing. So it says, now this is very interesting from I got the research, because this gives us a clue to why apoptosis is so critical for us to understand when we're talking about what are commonly called viruses. I'm going to just give you two sentences and then explain it. One aspect of the cell lineage particularly caught my attention, in addition to the 959 cells generated during worm development and found in the adult. Another 131 cells are generated but are not present in the adult. These cells are absent because they undergo programmed cell death. And this is Horowitz, one of the Nobel Prize winners, writing in his book, Worms, Life, and Death, 2002. So putting that into context, these worms that they're examining have a very short life expectancy. So they can see the entire life expectancy on a cellular level of the worms as they're growing. But they noticed that 131 of about 1,000 cells that were, or 1,100 cells that were in the larva stage of the worm, by the time it grew up, these had disappeared, and that was where they came to the idea of programmed cellular death. So the cells wouldn't be necessary in the adult species. Well, let's bring that fast forward to your and my body in the language that people can understand. Every minute, a person's body, a human body, which contains between 50 trillion and as maybe as much as 90 trillion cells, every minute our body replaces 300 million of those new cells. And then when it replaces those new cells, it does so through programmed cell death, a process we call apoptosis. Now, apoptosis is very important for understanding a number of processes. I wrote about the logic of chronic diseases in my book, Living Super in Paradise, in specific looking at cancer. And here's what I wrote about apoptosis. One paragraph, it's not very long. Our normal, healthy body consists of 50 trillion cells working in cooperation And each minute, the body generates some 300 million new cells. If new cells only accumulated, then we would grow larger and larger with each passing day. There must be a natural process through which we remove old cells. Apoptosis is a natural pattern of cell death affecting single cells, which proceeds along 4 stages. Now, this 4 stages is very important. Number 1, shrinkage of the cell as it's being programmed to die. First, it begins to shrink. Number 2, condensation of cell chromosome materials. That's the DNA. Number 3, fragmentation of the cell into membrane-bound fragments, which answers the riddle of, quote, what is a virus, unquote. And 4, cleaning up the debris through phagocytosis, meaning recycling cell molecular material, through autophagy, which where your body recycles and then gets rid of some of it, and waste removal. So this process called apoptosis, programmed cell death, is also what I claim, evidence shows, is the origin of what are called viruses.
All right. So since this is natural occurring, where does the body get rid of the dead cells?
Well, the normal process for getting rid of cellular debris, junk, is, of course, through multiple processes. The primary processes being urination and defecation. The bile, which is secreted by the gallbladder going into the blood, binds to these debris-like materials and waste materials. And once the bile is bound to them, it finds its way into the eliminative tract. So a good part of what we know as excretory material or feces actually consists of bile-bound debris from cellular debris. Of course, urination also eliminates quite a bit of it, which is why hydration is so very important to the type of constancy of detoxification that keeps us in the healthy zone. And when we are not eliminating through those 2 primary tracks sufficiently, then this material starts to come out through our pores. It comes out in sweat. It can encapsulate itself. If it can't get out of the body, it can encapsulate itself, or become encapsulated, I should say, by the body, and form what are called cysts and tumors and other type of materials where these debris, this junk, gets bound up and somehow gets stuck inside the body.
Can the human body produce an abnormal amount of dead cells in which it can't expel the dead cells fast enough? If so,
Yes.
can that lead to
Oh,
disease,
okay.
and what types of diseases?
Oh, absolutely. And when this happens, this is because the normal self-determining process of cell death, which is called apoptosis, itself is being interfered by stressors from outside the body. And at that point, we have a process called necroptosis. Here's how I described it in one brief paragraph. Similar to autophagy, necroptosis is mediated, meaning affected, impacted, controlled, by environmental triggers to so-called death receptors in the cell membrane. Once triggered, necroptosis breaks down organelles within the cell, disintegrating mitochondrial, lysosomal, and plasma membranes, meaning the components, the little organelles inside of a cell start to disintegrate. Necroptosis can occur because of pathogenic disorder due to ischemic injury, meaning insufficient blood supply, blood clogging, high blood pressure, neurodegeneration, or inflammation from an active infection. And so this process of necroptosis is the cell is not ready to die because of autophagy, but because of these external stressors, it basically invades the cell and kills off the cell, breaking down its root components, similar to apoptosis. And so necro is, of course, is a Latin word that means dead, osis meaning a condition. So dead condition is what this is. It essentially is somewhat it's an invader, but again, it can be not from necessarily under one source. It could be anything from chemicals to, it did talk about neurodegeneration, inflammation. So it could be active infection from a spectrum of different pathogens. And if we believe the viral theory, then necroptosis could be triggered by viruses. But then again, that causes confusion if you accept that the virus may have been created by the cell in the first place. Well, how then can we get away with saying that our body creates something within the cell that then comes back to kill the cell? It doesn't make sense. It's kind of a logic loop that doesn't make sense.
Okay. So, will that lead to any types of diseases or like cancer or diabetes within this
Oh yes,
section? Okay.
necroptosis can cause a spectrum of diseases. Again, it's related to active infection from inflammation, and we know inflammation itself is the root of some 200 different disease diagnoses. But if we're looking specifically for the impact of necroptosis, one of the most obvious ways is the so-called flesh-eating bacteria. That's the same process. I can't remember the exact name, scientific name for flesh-eating bacteria, but I know necro is on the front end of it, and it's essentially the exact same process. Only on this case, the toxicity of the cell destruction or the impact of cell destruction is magnified so greatly that people can lose whole limbs in just days because of this necrotizing fascicia. That's the word I was looking for, meaning necro, killing, fascicia, invading species. So most of the time, necrotizing fascicia is caused by toxins that are themselves the waste products of aggressive bacteria.
Okay. All right. So AIDS. What is AIDS and COVID, and can COVID-19 be classified as AIDS?
Ooh, that's a wonderful bridge between two concepts that are both confusing. They both have a scientific basis for understanding. And for me to completely answer that question would take me about 3 hours, and I'd have to put up about 30 or 40 scientific references to bring us along. But just to summarize,
All
what
right.
is AIDS? AIDS appears as a distinct element after 1984. Before 1984, with the definition of AIDS, there were some 8 to 12 other clinical descriptions of the same process before AIDS comes along. You have the AIDS stands for acquired immune deficiency syndrome. You also had IDS before that as a clinical definition, immune deficiency syndrome. You had severe immune deficiency syndrome, SIDS, and you had severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome. In essence, when they're talking about a syndrome, they're just saying a whole bunch of things are happening. They seem to be coordinated, so we're going to call them a syndrome as opposed to a certain disease. What most people don't realize is long before the idea that a virus just appearing on the scene called HIV is now the cause of immunodeficiency syndromes, again, which have been defined for many, many decades before. Now it's supposed to be caused by HIV. In the same way, now we're seeing that COVID-19, which is about fifth name change, they've changed the name again since then, but COVID-19 is now said to cause the pneumonia, which is at the core of death of all of the clinical morphology, the presentation of coronavirus deaths, all of them are pneumonia. So now in 1984, they came up with the idea that HTLV3, which was, I think, its second or third name change for AIDS, or HIV/AIDS, was the cause of the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. That proposal was really flaky. It was really flaky science, and even 5 Nobel Prize winning scientists at that time complained, this is not good quality science, but the world seems to have overlooked that in the era of AIDS. So could COVID be claimed to be the same thing? On one hand, most firmly, yes, insofar as bad representation of the scientific method, the rules which have traditionally applied, like Koch's postulates for proving that something does definitely cause this disease in all cases, and it doesn't make up its rules as it goes along. Those are Koch's postulates. They were thrown away in the age of AIDS, and they're being thrown away now in the age of COVID. And on the other hand, they both represent processes, natural processes, within the body by which our natural immune system has been thrown out of whack, and now we're susceptible to opportunistic infections. In the case of AIDS, that was what the problem was, opportunistic infections, where your immune system weak. Now they take an opportunity to get you, whereas if your immune system wasn't weak, they couldn't harm you. And then in the case of COVID, this now being the cause of 0.83%, less than 1% of already existing year-long background pneumonia deaths with any one country or in the world in general. So, yes, it can be drawn together. I think that's a brilliant question.
Okay. So let's go on to our next topic, pandemic. I'll just give you a couple of the questions, and if you want to answer all of them at one time, that you can. But if you want me to repeat them, I'll go ahead. So, what is a pandemic? Is COVID-19 really a pandemic? What example or examples of a pandemic occurred, and how was it resolved? And is there a modern day pandemic that the media and possibly government officials are not talking about that should be taken into consideration?
Okay, give me that fourth one again. I'm making notes.
Okay. Is there a modern day pandemic that the media
Mm-hmm.
and possibly government officials are not talking about that should be taken into consideration?
Mm-hmm. That's very good. Okay, so first, what is a pandemic? According to accepted definitions from various national health agencies and the World Health Organization, a pandemic is an infectious disease outbreak, or let's say an infectious condition outbreak that takes place across borders. So it can affect various countries in a region of the planet, or it can be on multiple continents at the same time. So that's their definition, an infectious outbreak that spans national borders. So when we talk about is COVID, I use the name 2019-nCoV, and I like it with the N in it, in that they say it's novel, which meaning if it's novel, then the person reading that might comprehend, well, if this one's novel, what are the other coronaviruses? And I've been able to identify with this one a total of 18 of them that I write about in the literature that I'm putting out. And so, is this really a pandemic? It's going to be almost impossible to say that definitively, because outside of the news reports and outside of the often self-interested reports of epidemiological agencies, which themselves now are the cowboys riding in on the white horse, and there's a part of human nature that says, oh, the people think I'm a hero, well, let me hold my back up, my shoulders up, and tell them, well, now that I'm your hero, here's what you need to do. And that's what's happening across this epidemiological community right now. And this community, I've been monitoring them for 30 years plus, they have made so many mistakes. We recognize names like Zika, like HIV was supposed to have wiped out 10 million Americans and 100 million Africans by 1990 when they first started talking about it. It was supposed to kill off the entire childbearing age population of Haiti by 1992. And by 1992, we found out that Haiti still had the second highest fertility rate in the Western Hemisphere behind Guatemala. So their pronouncements of these epidemiologists have been wrong, and then they've missed some very obvious things that they should be warning the public about. So is COVID a true pandemic? If you listen to these people whose jobs are claimed to be the ones that you rely upon, they say yes. But if you listen to other people who are dissenting from these claims and saying that without a true test, a way of identifying with complete certainty who is and who is not infected, and that's the process we called Koch's postulates. Without that, you don't know who's infected. And when you're rushing, fast-tracking all of these antibody assays into the public and getting people to take them at the numbers of taking them, you have guaranteed that you will have a pandemic, because that's what we call in this testing community surveillance bias. Essentially, you have a closed group, and if you test everyone within that group with these antibody assays, that's where the epicenter of the disease is going to be. The more of these tests you concentrate with any group or with any area, the more you see that area becomes the epicenter. Despite the fact that the people may be in perfectly normal health, they have been exposed to something in their lifetime which triggered a positive reaction on these highly non-sensitive, non-specific tests. And then you talked about examples of pandemics. There have been several pandemics. Right now, the greatest pandemic affecting the Western world, especially concentrated in the United States, is cancer. And when we look at cancer in the most developed nations, cancer is outrageous. In the United States, the rate of cancer in one's lifetime is now 38.4%. And then men, it's slightly higher than women. 2 out of every 5 men in America will develop cancer in their lifetime, and just slightly over 1 out of every 3 women will develop cancer. And when we look at cancer rate explosion into the population over the last 200 years, in the year 1900, the rate of cancer in the population was only 4 out of 100. By the year 2000, it was 6 out of 100. No, it wasn't 6. It was went from 4 to 24 out of 100. It increased sixfold in 1 century, and now we see it at 38.4%, meaning it's well over 1 out of every 100, or 1 out of every 3. So it's an outrageous pandemic. But insofar as infectious disease pandemics, we've seen times when they spread real rapidly. Probably the most dramatic is the migration of European people into the Western Hemisphere, when their indigenous diseases that they had become accustomed to for centuries invaded these pristine populations and created horrifying international death from communicable diseases.
Okay, so you did mention that the European coming to the West, now we know as America or North America. How was that resolved in terms of like the pandemic? Was it their diet? Did the natives like do something to say, hey, you might want to try this out? How was that resolved?
It pretty much wiped out so many of the population that the pandemic lost its momentum. It couldn't find enough fresh new people, and of course, people do develop new antibody structures that, if they're able to survive it, develop antibodies, and then have children and pass those off to the next generation in the form of reverse transcriptase, or RNA, being encoded into their DNA, and mothers suckling their babies on their breasts so they could share their immune system. Eventually, the population is going to build up a tolerance to it. But to be clear, in many cases, European diseases wiped out, in some cases, 30%. In some cases, they believe they wiped out 90% of the native populations.
Wow. Okay, I think you
And then
answered.
just another
Okay.
example, I just want to give one more example of a pandemic that they're not giving attention to. 2 examples, and one is pneumonia. Pneumonia remains always every year one of the 3 top killers on the planet, and it's one of the leading causes of death, if not the leading cause of death, of the elderly. In Italy, in this case of coronavirus, they're saying the average age of those who died in Italy of coronavirus was 79.5 years of age, and the majority of them had 3 or 2 comorbid conditions, such as diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, and in many cases, they had cancer. And we have elderly men, 2 celebrities died, musicians died, or musicians and artists died over the past weekend, and they're not allowed to have the other diseases that kill men who are 88 and 81 years old in America. Black men die on average at about 70 years old. So these guys lived good longevity, but they're not allowed to die of old age anymore. Now they die of coronavirus 19. That is insulting to the memory of the lives of these people, and it's insulting to all of our intelligence that we buy into something this devious.
Okay. Well, I guess that answered the last question of the pandemic topic. Is there a modern day pandemic that the media and possibly government officials are not talking about that the world should be taking into consideration? But I think you answered that.
I'll
Yeah.
name 3. cancer, pneumonia, and malnutrition.
All right, there you go. Do you think the society will go back to business as usual after the lockdown has been lifted, or do you think people will be more paranoid and continue to buy, racks of toilet paper from the shelves?
This is a major game changer. In my lifetime, I've lived through several of these. I remember November 22nd, 1963, when the young, charismatic president of the United States was shot in a motorcade, his head blown off with a lot of people watching. I remember April 4th, 1968, when in the middle of a spate of about 5 years of serious urban uprisings across America, as the civil rights movement now goes to a more radical stage, and the people are just revolting in these cities. Well, in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination, within days, 8 cities went into flame in massive way, and they even rolled out army equipment with 50 caliber machine guns shooting at high-rise poverty tenements. And I do remember the Y2K, which turned out to be a dud, but I remember the massive hysteria that took place before that, and we do remember the massive hysteria which takes place after 9/11, when there is a quote-unquote new Pearl Harbor that forever changed the status of the world. So this is a major game changer, and I don't think we've even come to see the worst of it yet. But inside of all of these major disruptions of the old world order, there is the light of a new seed that is birthed. I am seeing young people right now bringing something to this planet that I think could be incredibly healing, incredibly wonderful. And if we're looking for the most effective and impressive leadership, I am particularly impressed with what's happening in the global South, in particular South Asia, and in particular across the African continent. There is a new light that's rising on the horizon, Kepra, the keeper of the morning sun. And I think we should all be alerted to that new light, and we should usher in this new era of sustainability to the best of our abilities.
All right. Is there anything else you wanted to mention? Your social media, website, etc., that people can reach out? Any books?
The questions, the questions you put together today in this episode was absolutely was wonderful. A great set of questions, and I'm hoping that my responses will inspire people to go out and do the research. Take every sentence that I've said and look for factual data to refute it or to validate it. This is the process by which we all individuals rise to our greatest mental, spiritual, and empowerment. And so people who want to know more what I do, there's a beautiful website called livingsuperfood.com. You know it well. That's why we're having this series of conversations. Food is nature's most perfect medicine. So if you're looking to stay out of the grips of COVID or HIV or Zika virus or swine flu or Legionnaire's disease, all of these, we remember all of them. Then you
Right.
can just reinforce your natural immunity the way nature intended it. Nature produced the best medicine ever. And of course, we show you how to make that medicine as gourmet food. I'm very proud of what you're doing. I see you as one of these brilliant young lights that's rising up, my brother Umoya, rising up to show the world the greatest of human potential. I, of the baby boomer generation, am trying to convince as many of my peers as possible, let's stop being so selfish and let's lay down a foundation by which this brilliant young generations that are following us, they can stand on our shoulders just as we stood on the shoulders of giants.
Ashe. All right. Looks like that does it for this program. Want to thank everybody for listening. And until next time, everybody be safe. This is the Living Superfood Show.